Hello, everybody. I'm Lucas Brasiskis, one of the artistic directors of this edition of the Biennale, together with Anton Vidokle and Heli Ayres. It's nice to see you here. I hope you all had already a chance to go upstairs and see the exhibition and Nakwan Arcade part of it. If not, we are encouraging you to do it. And just quickly, this is the first public event. We opened the Biennale, as you know, yesterday, and quite a few other events will follow. After this talk, we will have a first roundtable with artists who participate in the Biennale, and tomorrow the same model will repeat. We will have a public talk at 4 and another second part of a roundtable with the participating artists at 5:30. And then we will have a cinema program opening on Saturday at Seoul Art Cinema here nearby, and many other public events, so you're encouraged to follow, I guess, social media and the website and participate in them. But getting back to today, we're very, very happy to have with us Elena Vogman, who responded very enthusiastically, and we're thankful for her openness to respond to our theme of this Biennale, and by presenting the first public talk here, which is titled Séance, Technology of Desalination. As you all know, the Biennale's title is a Séance, Technology of the Spirit, and Séance is an important term for us from the very beginning of research, thinking, and finally selecting artists and building up a Biennale, the term that was informative both as a method and as some kind of a model for the Biennale. So it's the term's history spans at least 200 years, from spiritual sciences to psychoanalytical sciences to cinema sciences, and we knew that Elena's work is interestingly related to at least a few of these historical uses of science, and we asked her to think, could she contribute, and she responded positively. So we will have here talk on Séance as technology of desalination. And for some of you who might not know, Elena Vogman is a scholar of comparative literature and media, and she's principal investigator of a research project, Madness, Media, Milieu, Reconfiguring the Humanities in Post-War Europe at Bauhaus University Weimar, as well as visiting fellow at ICI Institute for Cultural Inquiry in Berlin. And her current work focuses on the politics of madness and its intersections with decolonial discourse, psychoanalysis, feminism, and institutional psychotherapy. She has published 2 books, Sensuous Thinking, Eisenstein's Eccentric Method in 2018, and Dance of Values, Sergei Eisenstein's Capital Project in 2019. Great books on Sergei Eisenstein, and was visiting professor at Shanghai, at École Normale Supérieure in Paris and New York University, Shanghai. Together with Maria Rebecci and Till Gatman, she co-curated Sergei Eisenstein and the Anthropology of Rhythm, the exhibition from 2017, and Eccentric Values after Eisenstein in 2018. So please welcome, together with me, Elena Vogman.
Thank you so much for this warm welcome, Lucas, and warm introduction. I'm very pleased and honored to be here and to be part of this extraordinary opening of the Media City Biennale, Séance, Technology of the Spirit, curated by Anton Vidokle, Heli Ayres, and Lucas Brasiskis. So thank you so much for inviting me and for also continuing this very inspiring conversation, exchange we have. To be honest, I also feel quite overwhelmed having walked through the exhibition spaces several times already, seeing how the artworks are immersed in and animated through color, which was something I heard about but could only experience in these 2 days. So their chromatic environments, how they speak to one another through their montage, the works, within these concrete sensuous color spaces. So allow me just maybe a few words about these strong impressions, which I'm still processing. The German poet and color theorist Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, an important figure for philosopher Rudolf Steiner, whose panels open the exhibition, wrote, I quote Goethe, "When light presents itself and objects with a general indifference, color always appears as specific, characteristic, meaningful." End of quote. This singularity of experience that color grants to reality, as Goethe concluded, is equivalent to a decision. So Goethe calls color a decision, importantly. Decision to express, to reevaluate phenomena, and to generate new meanings. So to think of an exhibition as this kind of chromatic séance is to imagine just such a process, one in which disparate cultural, technological, and sensorial dimensions are drawn into a constellation, animating and modulating one another. It is a quite ambitious and visionary undertaking, and one I feel really privileged to witness and to join. And of course, epistemically, this complex séance challenges the dominant conception of arts as autonomous and profane domain. It reconstructs and repairs the forces of alternative modes of knowing and experiencing, establishing forms of transmission and relation that modulate our understanding of the living. And I think living and life are very important notions today. Extending this understanding, this modulated, transformed understanding, into the spectral, the unconscious, and the non-yet. So I would like to thank the curators Anton, Halli, and Lucas for this invitation, but also the entire Biennale team for their incredible support and generosity, and also the translators who accompany me. Okay, I will. So today, in my presentation, I will propose some thoughts and historical materials related to a very specific constellation around Séance, understood mainly in psychoanalytic and cinematic terms, but also as a process of reimagining cinema and psychoanalysis, as a collective technology of healing and disalienation. On June 2nd, 1961, in the French region of Lozère, at the cinema of Sainte-Chélie-d'Apcher, near the psychiatric clinic of Saint-Albin, a very special séance took place. It was a film screening organized at the request of François Toscaïès, a militant anarchist doctor in exile from Catalonia, who was one of the main initiators of the radical psychiatry movement known as institutional psychotherapy, which will be at the center of my presentation today. So this séance invited an audience composed of psychiatric patients, nurses, doctors, farmers, and local villagers to view films which were shown and discussed afterwards with these audiences. The first film was Mad Masters by pioneer of ethnographic cinema Jean Rouch, and the second film was Chronicle of a Summer from 1961, so from the same year, by Rouch and so by the same director Jean Rouch and sociologist Edgar Morin. So the first film, The Mad Masters, was banned in France shortly after its completion in 1955. It features the possession rituals and trance states of the Hauka movement in the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana. It was performed by African workers and migrants who embody and subvert European colonial figures such as Governor, engineer and soldier. So it was a clearly decolonial film which was banned for its, censored immediately for its content. The second film, Chronicle of a Summer, is another ethnographic film that by contrast focuses on everyday life in Paris. It relinquishes the authority of a voiceover in favor of a polyphonic speech. Scattered voices captured in both intimate exchanges and convivial group conversations with factory workers, students, artists, and immigrants. The film's participatory approach treats the subjects as active collaborators. Alongside Rouge and Morin, so the directors, they conduct interviews with Parisians on themes such as happiness, memory, labor, and alienation. Issues of racism, the French colonial wars, and the Holocaust trauma, highly political topics at the time, emerge as both topics in the discussions, but also symptoms inscribed in the film bodies and environments. This founding film of direct cinema, or French cinéma vérité, explores, in a way, the limits of participation in cinema, unsettling the boundary between camera and film subjects, history and phantasm. At the time, the film was not officially released in cinemas in Paris, so the screening in the province of Saint-Albin, very far away from the center, with psychiatric patients, can be seen as a very special avant-première, so before even the official release of the film. One could ask, why show these films, kind of experimental avant-garde films, to the rural population in peripheral southern France? What role could play the psychiatric patients or doctors' account in the film's political or aesthetic impacts? The archives of the production company, which sent the film copies to Saint-Albin, preserve a report of the discussion which took place after the screening. The viewers, sometimes anonymous voices as protocoled, the viewers emphasize the unique relation between the camera and the lived experience, but also the experimental use of sound. A patient whose comment concludes the report admires the use of non-professional actors in the film, stating, I quote, "You don't need to be an actor to become a star. It's within everyone's reach." Such statements recall the political horizon of those early Soviet films, which were programmed by patients in the internal cineclubs at the hospital of Saint-Albin. These films, I just, as examples, show here Dziga-Vertov's kind of canonical work, but there are many others which were programmed by patients in cineclubs inside the hospital. So these films reject theatrical acting in favor of a cinema as a tool for constructing and transforming reality. The Soviet concept of typage, in which actors embodied social types rather than individual heroes, designated both typical representatives of a class and their capacity to act in their environment, extending cinema into real life. So grounded in this active relational dynamic between cinema and the real, the 1961 Séance, with films by Rouge and Morin, along with experimental use of media at Saint-Albin, form part of a collective therapeutic technology, a tool for reinventing or intervening in the mental and social environments of the clinic. What are the potentialities of a séance as both a cinematic and therapeutic, even psychoanalytic session? So addressing the theory and media history of institutional psychotherapy, I will trace these implications for this therapeutic form of mediation and stakes for the present as a technology of disalienation. Some of you might know the term of alienation as one of the key concepts in Hegel's philosophy, but also in Marx's political economy. Yet before entering this kind of philosophical, political, economical framework, the notion coming from the Latin alienatio carried two meanings. First, a juridical one, meaning legal dispossession, applied often to territories such as annexation, and the second, a medical one, meaning madness or the loss of reason. Bringing these genealogies together with Marx and Freud, institutional psychiatry addressed a double alienation, mental and social alienation of the self, of the patient, from their participation in the environment. It reclaimed this alienation as a collective process of restitution and repair of both psychic life and environments in which it unfolds. The Catalan psychiatrist and initiator of the movement, François Tosquelles, critically countered the phobia of madness that characterized psychiatry. According to him, psychiatrists were profoundly afraid of their patients. This fear led to the systematic restriction of their freedom. Patients were imprisoned in hospitals, locked into straitjackets, and prevented from roaming freely. Against this, Tosquelles advocated for patients' right to movement, their freedom to wander the earth, to roam. On this image here, taken at the Saint-Elma hospital, you see Tosquelles dressed in a white medical coat, performing a doctor in the position of the patient, a psychiatrist undergoing a treatment. With this gesture, he inverted the diagnostic situation. It is the psychiatrist himself who needs to be examined. The message could be clear. Psychiatry must heal itself of its own fear of madness. By presenting himself as a mad psychiatrist, Tosquelles enacted a critique of psychiatry from within. A denunciation of the phobia of madness was not only theoretical, but also embodied, mediated, and dramatized. It revealed that without confronting their own anxieties, psychiatrists could never hope to transform the institution, nor accompany the patients in their process of repair. So departing from this major reversal, I would like to show institutional psychotherapy as a designed a therapy of not of patients primarily, but of psychiatric institutions, hereby redefining madness as both a lived experience of catastrophe and an attempt at self-repair. In this process, the movement conceived of Séance as part of its participatory repurposing of technology and, of course, involving technology in the healing processes themselves within the project of disalienation, as they framed this kind of conceptual work, to which I will come in a minute. The broader implications of this understanding of media, and in particular of film as montage of social and mental ecologies, can be traced in projects that continued and transformed the methods of institutional psychotherapy, such as psychiatrist and decolonial activist Frantz Fanon's practice in Blida-Janville in Algeria, or the famous experiences at Laborde Psychiatric Clinic in France, undertaken by Félix Guattari, Jean Horry, Jeanette Michaud, and many others. So in the following, in the first step, I will kind of sketch the clinical theory situated between psychoanalysis and the reinvention of psychiatry. And in the second, I will draw on the media experiments as technology of disalienation at the core of clinical and social practice of the movement of institutional psychotherapy. So institutional psychotherapy emerged in the wake of World War II and the German occupation of France, which led to the mass extermination of psychiatric patients during the severe famine that swept through hospitals. During this time, the peripheral hospital of Saint-Elma became an asylum in the literal sense of the word, a refuge not only for patients, but also for Jewish migrants, members of the Resistance, and surrealist artists, including Georges Canguilhem, Tristan Tzara, Nouché Loire, Paul Éluard, and many others. Engaging with the existing social structures of the region, patients were employed on local farms. Activities like sewing, spinning, or knitting for the villagers supplied elements of the barter economy in Lozère. So these practices, collective practices of patients, nurses, doctors, villagers, helped the hospital to survive the severe scarcity and resist the program of extermination against people with disabilities. After the war, the eugenic and racist conditions of psychiatry were collectively exposed and challenged by the movement. And I briefly quote here philosopher and activist, also psychoanalyst, Felix Guattari, who remembers this time as following. Incapable of supporting concentration camp institutions any longer, few nurses, doctors undertook to transform services from top to bottom, knocking down fences and organizing the fight against famine. Surrealist intellectuals, doctors strongly influenced by Freudianism and Marxism, militants all mingled. So the historical experience of the war was also strongly reflected in François Toscaïev's doctoral dissertation, which he defended shortly after the war, and which was titled "The Lived Experience of the End of the World in Madness, the Testimony of Gérard de Nerval." In this study, Toscaïev took up the challenge of thinking the experience of catastrophe in at least 3 dimensions. So in its clinical expression as the form of schizophrenia, in its political and historical scope in the inscription of the war, which patients whom he quotes directly kind of witness, and third, in a very interesting atmospheric and poetic analysis of Gérard de Nerval, so a 19th century novelist, romantic writer, French romantic writer, in his novel Aurélia, which was written shortly before Nerval's suicide in 1855. So Toscaïev's book also draws on psychoanalysis other, the so-called kind of other, namely its disengagement with psychosis. As you might know, psychoanalysis is mostly treating neurosis, that is minor disorders, in which a person maintains the contact with reality, and which is treated via linguistic cure, so psychoanalytic therapy. Psychosis, by contrast, is a severe disturbance where reality testing itself is impaired. Schizophrenia and other forms of psychosis can be taken as example. So Toscaïev departs from 2 cases of psychoanalytic discussion of psychosis, namely Sigmund Freud's account of the case of Daniel Paul Schreber and Jacques Lacan's early emphasis on the patient's lived experience of psychosis. So I start with Lacan. As you probably know, Lacan, the early Lacan is maybe lesser known than the later Lacan. So in the 1930s, Lacan was better received in surrealist circles than within psychoanalytic or psychiatric community. His scathing critique of psychiatry was also closely aligned with German existentialism and phenomenology. Interestingly, Lacan insists in his articles published in surrealist journals where kind of Dr. Lacan publishes alongside Pablo Picasso, Michel Ries, Georges Bataille, Salvador Dali, André Breton, and many others. So you see here a couple of pages from a journal where then appears Jacques Lacan's text. And here Lacan, very importantly, insists that psychiatry has to recognize the dynamic primordiality and originality of the lived experience of the patient. So lived experience goes before any objectification of an event. And he quotes Erlebnis and Geschehnis from German phenomenology and existentialism. So it's also like a philosophical reflection. So in this surrealist journal Minotauro, where the article was published, Lacan's basically also presents this experience of schizophrenia as a lens through which to study artistic processes. And here he says, I quote him, "Now, certain of these forms of lived experience, called morbid, so pathological, appear to be particularly prolific in modes of symbolic expression, which, as for being irrational in their foundation, are not less furnished with an immanent intentional signification and with a very lofty, tensed communicability." So from this very interesting focus on art and the lived experience, Dostoevsky extrapolates what he calls anthropological clinic to conceptualize the patient's lived experience or erlebnis as the relation between the singularity of this kind of experience and the world which it creates. So the lived experience engenders a world with which psychiatrists have to count. This is the first and foremost in the cure. What is at stake, Dostoevsky wrote, is the dynamic which produces the lived experience of a person, giving it its existential efficacy. And the notion of Erlebnis in German comes from Leben, which is life. So it introduces this kind of irreducible dimension of the lived temporality of the end of the world, which is experienced in schizophrenia, and at the same time its complex and paradoxical continuity. So this entangled non-linear temporality becomes crucial for Dostoevsky's reading of one of psychoanalysis' maybe most famous cases, Schreber. The German judge developed a highly elaborate psychotic system, and maybe some of you know, he used his memoirs, called Memoirs of My Nervous Illness, published in 1993, as a medium to record and structure his hallucinations, delusions, and experiences of hearing voices and kind of persecuting him. So Freud, in his own reading of Schreber, analyzes what he calls the mediated fantasy of the end of the world. I'm going to bring a short quote from this famous essay on the case of Schreber by Freud. At the climax of his illness, Schreber became convinced of the immediate, of a great catastrophe, of the end of the world. He himself was the only real man left alive, and a few human shapes that he still saw, the doctors, the attendants, and other patients, he explained are being miracled up, curiously improvised men. Occasionally, the converse current of feeling also made itself apparent. A newspaper was put into his hands in which there was a report of his own death. He himself existed in a second inferior shape, and in his second shape, he one day quietly passed away. So Schreber experiences the world he has scattered in shadows. The meticulous account he provides of this shattered world stems from his systematic attempt to put this dissolution into words. Human shapes appearing in the repeated rhythmic phrase, which Freud repeats, miracled up, curiously improvised, in German, flüchtig hingemachte Männer. So this phrase has a rhythm. It's very important. So the words be a witness to this fleeing, decomposing of the world which Schreber experiences. And yet, Freud sees in Schreber's mediation of catastrophe a kind of a dialectical phenomenon, one which also becomes crucial for Dostoevsky, namely, in the repetition, in this kind of rhythmic repetition of witnessing of the dissolution, the world becomes reconstructed and repaired. So it is like a melody, a rhythm, which recreates this world. So it's very important, this kind of aesthetic, poetic dimension of this experience. And so Freud concludes that the delusional formation, which we take to be the pathological product, is in reality an attempt at recovery, a process of reconstruction. So in other words, the symptom in its performed materiality is an expression basically of the first step towards reconstruction of the world. But how can a work of delusion be simultaneously a process of self-repair? According to Dostoevsky, psychoanalysis has not gone far enough in this crucial insight. Incapable of grasping this inherent dynamism of the psychotic lived experience, instead it operates with notions like regression as a true catch-all concept in psychopathology, as Dostoevsky says. So basically with a kind of a mythical explanation which doesn't bring psychiatry further or psychoanalysis further with treatment of psychosis. Instead, Dostoevsky addresses, basically in his critique, he turns to a very important figure who was once pivotal for many of his contemporaries, from Georges Canguilhem to Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the German Jewish neurologist Kurt Goldstein. Goldstein developed, in the wake of the catastrophe of World War I, particularly through his study of the brain injuries, a very far-reaching theory of brain plasticity. He was director of the Moabit Hospital in Berlin. He conducted a series of experiments using also film camera to record his patients' movements in time. According to Goldstein, recovery is never a return to an old state or any pre-established norm. It is the organism's complex and creative effort to reinvent itself in this confrontation with the environment. So far from being a mere deficit, the symptom or an injury for Goldstein is an attempted solution. Recovery, as he writes, is a newly achieved state of ordering function. It's a new individual norm. In accounting for the crisis brought about by the symptom, emotional confusion or despair, inability to adapt immediately to the situation, Goldstein speaks of catastrophic reactions, which are very important for him, as he calls them, inevitable way stations in the process of self-actualization. So basically expressions of the individual's inescapable participation in the general imperfections of the living world. It's very important to basically understand pathology as a reactualization and a chance at singularization. So this is a small excursus basically to the clinical, complex clinical kind of theory Dostoevsky constructs with all these different sources in order to reinvent an understanding of madness, of psychosis as a creative kind of attempt of the organism to confront the environment, and not as a lack, not as a deficit. Now, if schizophrenia is an apocalyptic experience, right, experience of the end of the world, then aesthetic production is a form of world creation or world reappropriation through a form of bricolage. The Saint-Albin patient, Auguste Forestier, whom you see here, constructed his sculptures out of simple objects. Remnants of everyday life he gathered at the hospital, old pieces of wood, scrap, rubber, glass, broken buttons, etc. The psychiatrist Jean Noury, who founded the Laborde Clinic, described the immanent relation between Forestier's work and life. He said there is no way to draw a distinction between the artist and his work, in case of Forestier. Reworking his objects, Forestier reconstructs himself. His body, I quote him, his body borrows its order, its material from a vast disorder of the world. Such vital entanglements become even more palpable in Forestier's choice of certain elements. For instance, here, it's a very important figure, La Bête du Givaudan, the monster of Givaudan, which is also a mythical kind of bestia, monster, said to be strolling in Lozère and attacking its inhabitants. So it kind of became a symbol of institutional psychotherapy, exactly this sculpture. So here, Forestier takes real raw beef or sheep teeth from kind of the hospital kitchen and inserts into his monstrous or real bricolage, montage of kind of real elements. So here, psychosis appeared not as a passive condition or a biological deficit, but an expression of an affirmative potential imbued with freedom and sense of responsibility. This is how Dostoevsky kind of reformulated pathology. So, crucially for Dostoevsky, institutional psychotherapy could not efface catastrophe, whether mental or geopolitical, but might instead reconfigure resistance and repair from within the catastrophic horizons of history and ruinations. Therefore, it refused to address merely individual bodies and their symptoms, but instead addressed social, mental, but also geographical and environmental conditions in which these symptoms have evolved. So basically, active reconstruction of the clinic using different workshops, collective, individual, but also film and media. And so, as I already mentioned, that the movement operated through group therapies and restructuring of an institution, using broad, like a wide range of media practices such as film, printing workshops. So basically, of an intra-hospital journal which circulated inside the hospital and was completely, entirely made and printed by patients, but also cartography workshops, outings, audio recording, and several other media experiments involved in the life of the hospital. So those media served to reinvent the geography of the given relations, to produce environments, institutions, and milieus that would facilitate psychological therapy and healing. So coming back now to the Séance with which I started, so basically now we understand that this avant-garde experimental cinema screening was not an exception at Saint-Albin, but was part of its kind of daily practice. And it was also part of this strategy of disalienation. This is further underscored by the fact that at the time when the double screening of Rouge and Morin happened at Saint-Albin, another trilogy of Cinéma Vérité was being produced in Lozère by the Italian-French filmmaker Mario Ruspoli, which happened in close collaboration with Dostoevsky. Ruspoli's cameramen were funding figures of Cinéma Vérité and Direct Cinema, which both collaborated on Chronicle of a Summer and transformed the studio-based documentary norms through handled camera techniques that were attuned to the spontaneous rhythms of speech, gestures, and settings. Basically, like more spontaneous settings of this new film movement. So 2 of these films were made directly in the hospital Saint-Albin. One is titled A Look at Madness, and the second, Captive Feast. So both films avoid voice-over explanation or clinical discourse, creating instead an atmosphere of attention and presence in the complex environment of the clinic marked by institutional transformations. The camera reveals the rhythms of life inside the institution, the textures of bodies, the materials, and the spaces of care as therapeutic agents in the project of disalienation. So in this sense, both films emerged as acts of participation in the lived experience of the hospital, and even more so, according to Dostoevsky, and I quote one of his yet unpublished texts where he speaks of one of these films made at Saint-Albin, saying that these films venture to make you truly participate in the life of these human beings, in their anxieties, hopes, and their struggle to reconnect with reality, with the social world, with everyday life, a struggle shared by doctors and patients alike. So participation in this form of cinematic experience, or expérience in French, meaning both scientific experiment and lived experience, was central to the socially situated project of disalienation. In the first place, it was a mediated, so technologically mediated redefinition of the psychoanalytic notion of transference toward a collective and milieu-generative dimension. And in the second place, which is I think also very interesting, this form of participation, reconfigured as a cinematic and collective mediation of transference, also shaped the methods and aesthetic language of cinéma vérité, or direct cinema. So basically, there is a transference between the Saint-Albin kind of technologies of healing and repair, and between this kind of avant-garde movement of direct cinema, coming, of course, mainly from Paris, and kind of participating in the bohemian kind of avant-garde cinematic life. So, to conclude, also to leave a bit of time for our discussion, I would like to, of course, there is still a lot to say, but I would like to show you the final sequence of this film by Mario Ruspoli, which you see here, The Fête Prisonnière, and a film made by François Tosquelles together with the patients of Saint-Albin and also his wife, Elena Alvarez Tosquelles, a film which has different titles and also different editorial, basically different montages, so it's circulated in different versions, primarily inside psychiatric hospitals. So first of all, it was shown to the patients themselves, and then it was also circulated in other institutions as a kind of manifesto, as a visual manifesto of institutional psychotherapy, but also of its social life and all the workshops invented inside the hospital. So in this sense, I would like you to experience the final sequences and how this notion of transference, which is at the same time psychoanalytic, or in this kind of reinvented way, collective psychoanalysis and technological transference, how these kind of mutual, kind of merged understanding of transference works kind of in between these two films. And while so maybe what is important for me here is that the media histories of institutional psychotherapy invite us to reconsider the séance as both a psychoanalytic and cinematic technology of disalienation. These minor experiments with media are reflected in the history of direct cinema, or cinéma vérité, even beyond the séance with Rouch and Morin. So on the left, you can see the film made by Tosquelles, which I just introduced briefly, by Elena Alvarez Tosquelles and the patients, with an 8mm Payard camera, kind of a minor medium, let's say a poor image. It was meant to be screened to patients and never have the same reach as the film on the right, which is a famous cinema, direct cinema kind of document. How these both films kind of capture the same carnival celebration filmed in different moments, but so despite its poor means, the film finds very strong resonance in Ruspoli's famous film Captive Feast, which you see here on the right. Both films are dedicated to the annual Fête Votive at Saint-Albin. Both films feature carnival celebrations organized around the region's patron saint. And both interestingly, avoid representation in favor of an act of participation, participating and mediating the complex temporality of this event. The objects and bodies recorded by the camera form part of this therapeutic environment of Saint-Alban. The costumes and masks, which you see here in both films, were crafted by patients during long preparations, ergotherapy sessions, but also the theatrical musical performances rehearsed in social therapy ateliers. Both films depict the environmental and social opening of the clinic, opening theorized by the movement as geopsychiatry, where basically you see the local inhabitants of Lozère, of the region, joining the patients, joining the clinic to celebrate together the fête votive. So this social transversality dismantles the binary between normal and the pathological, favoring instead a coexistence of singularities as explored in Goldstein, Canguilhem, Toscaïès, and partly even in Freud. Yeah, and finally I would like to suggest that a form of transference occurs between these two films, one that connects the gestures and movements of these carnivalesque collectives not only with one another or with the act of capturing them on film, but also with the transmission of these situated experiences into an open-ended temporality of the future in which new and different technologies of disalienation or different sciences might emerge in this kind of trans-historical communication of which film offers.
먼저 영화와 강령을 소외의 기술로 사용하여 접근하는 방식이 매우 흥미로웠습니다. 그래서 제가 드리고 싶은 질문은 말씀해 주신 강연에서 영화 속 몽타주가 이미지들이 어떻게 파편화된 이미지들, 예를 들어 몽타주 같은 그런 것들을 통해 관객 또는 환자에게 접근하는 방식이 탈소외의 기술로서 정신 분석 과정과 어떻게 다른지가 궁금하고요. 다음은 예술이 영화를 도구로서 병리를 다루는 것과 병리를 치유하는 것의 경계는 무엇일까요? 참여 혹은 관람일지 이게 궁금합니다.
Thank you for this question. I hope I understood it correctly. So the difference between pathologizing approaches, I think, and materials or the histories of institutional psychotherapy, I try to theorize, present through the lens of media experiments, are really central and I think also very actual today as I can observe and as I can read. So I think mainly one major difference, which historically was already very present at the time, that pathology in psychiatry, but also in other kind of form, like psychologists, developmental psychologists, which were proliferating at the time. Pathology was considered mainly as a biological inherited, so bodily deficit. Meanwhile, institutional psychotherapy tried to view by basically to add a social and mental dimension to it, and try to reconsider the sick, disabled, pathological body, not as a biological kind of lack or deficit, but much more as a singularity, as a body which has new qualities, new capacities. But these qualities need to be socially, supported and stimulated, one can say, developed. Biology is there, of course. We are all biological beings. But biology is never alone. Biology is always existing in the social, ethical, political context. And I think the work of Joanna Hedva, which is present here in the exhibition, is very dear to me and very close to the propositions made by institutional psychotherapy, even of course, we live in different times, challenges, languages are different, but I think this movement, and Joanna Hedvas, but also many other projects, for instance, Violetta, who is also very familiar with this history, the confidential replicas of bichos, which you can see on the ground floor, are also very close and kind of contemporary translations of similar messages, of similar ambitions, I would say, and stakes into today's realities and practices.
Thank you so much for this really fascinating lecture, and I was so compelled by how you were presenting a sort of subversion of the photographic apparatuses or machines that historically were more weaponized against the disabled and sick and all persons put in the position of otherness. And I had maybe two thoughts that I wanted to share, perhaps one you could react to and a question. So I was thinking about the experiences, and not the experiences, the experiments made by Charcot in La Salpêtrière with women, and how he was like staging women in the position of hysteria in a way that creating canonical and iconographies that were later used in science to prove the existence of hysteria, and then later people demonstrated that this was a total construct, and that as far as we are concerned, maybe this is not even an existent disease, but only something that happened through the mediated reality that was imposed on these women. And so I was very compelled of the relationship between that moment of history and cameras in hospitals and this moment where there's this subversion, no? And something that is almost decolonial happening here in terms of sovereignty and self-representation. And the question that I had that has perhaps nothing to do with this, but to come back to it, is that I would love to hear you come back to the notion of transfer and how the transfer happens, or how this process is like happening during the workshops and the relationship with cameras and the moving image. Thank you.
Thanks so much for these questions. Really, I mean, I try to be short. I could say a lot, but first of all, Salpêtrière and the hysteric bodies of female hysteric bodies. It's very interesting comparison. I think Georges Vogman wrote like very interesting, compelling study, but maybe not critical enough as I would see it today from the perspective of kind of the movement of institutional psychotherapy. But I think in one he was right. The book is titled Invention of Hysteria, and as you say, so Charcot invented hysteria with the medium of photography, you know, and it's very interesting that basically media do not just reproduce or represent, they construct, they intervene into the world. What Charcot concealed in his approach, right? He said, this is objective truth. And the contrary, I think, happened here with understanding media as collective construction, reconstruction of the world, and intervention, and kind of attempt at changing it, which we know from cinematic art practices, right? Like cinema is not representing reality. It is intervening into, you know, when we have a camera in the space changes, we behave differently, we know it. I mean, like sitting already, starting from this and ending with maybe the transformation occurring through viewing films, etc. So that's maybe a short answer on that. So, and of course the purposes here with media diametrically opposed to Charcot's kind of forensic approach, I would say, right? Like forensic, so to document pathology and to pin it down, and which is of course like reaches far into the 20th and 21st century, like forensic medicine, etc. So use of media, high tech media, continues to kind of accompany our realities. And the transference, thanks for this question, it was came a bit maybe too short in my talk. So in the theory of institutional psychotherapy, there were different vocabularies. So they said not transference, but scattered transference or transferential constellation, because transference in this kind of situation of psychosis, I would say, or like an experience of psychosis could not go through language. So psychotic patients, that's why psychoanalysis abandoned psychotics, because they cannot be treated through language. You cannot access, you cannot engage the person really with psychosis. So, but psychotics had a very interesting kind of, let's say, transformative relation with objects, with spaces, very sensitive to spaces. And so the first idea was that we need to extend the notion of transference onto objects, onto the collective setting, group therapies, and bring back the media dimension of transference, because psychoanalysis already, of course, operates with media and cinematic vocabulary, projection, the psychic apparatus, transference. These are all kind of witnesses of the being born together of psychoanalysis and cinema. So, and I think, this presence of technology, which complexifies the transferential constellation, it adds dimension, but also, to make a film collectively, to project this film, to see oneself also as a group on the film, had a very curative impact. And it's also very interesting to approach these archives, because we have a very interesting perspective, which is neither the psychiatric report or the medical report of a doctor or their theories, nor the art brut kind of manifestation of like a single artist, but we have this collective, much more complex document where perspective is changing. Patients are holding the camera. Of course, it's very difficult to reconstruct when do they hold the camera. Yeah, the editing was also partly collective, but also, of course, made by doctors often. Yeah, I hope I answered. Sorry for being long. Thank you very much. Thanks.